The park was still half asleep when the first rays of the sun broke over the distant rooftops. It was not the kind of park that tourists photographed. No fountains, no marble statues, just worn wooden benches, cracked pathways lined with weeds, and trees old enough to have seen generations come and go. Most mornings it was empty except for a few early runners or stray dogs searching for scraps. But that morning, a figure was there before the birds had finished their dawn chorus. He came walking slowly through the mist, a hood pulled low over his head, hands in the pockets of a simple gray hoodie. To anyone watching from afar, he might have looked like another drifter cutting through on his way to somewhere else, but he stopped near a corner of the park where the grass had been worn away and the earth was bare. He crouched and set down the things he carried: a folded canvas bag, a small metal spade, and a cloth-wrapped bundle that seemed almost too delicate for him to handle. The man's jeans were faded, frayed at the knees. His boots were scuffed, not the kind you buy to impress anyone. He knelt on the cold ground without hesitation, brushing away bits of trash, a cigarette butt, a bottle cap, before pulling the spade from the bag. The steel of the spade was old, its handle darkened from years of use. He gripped it and began to work the soil, quiet, steady, as if each motion carried a rhythm older than words. The earth was compacted from years of neglect, but he did not hurry. He pressed the blade in, levered out clumps, loosened roots from weeds, and worked until the hole was wide enough for something new. Every movement was deliberate, careful. He would dig for a while, then sit back on his heels and just look at the hole, as if seeing beyond the dirt into a memory only he knew. Somewhere beyond the park, traffic began to hum. A siren wailed in the distance. But here, in this small forgotten corner, time seemed to slow. He reached for the cloth bundle and opened it. Inside lay a sapling no taller than his knee, its thin trunk bound gently with a strip of twine, its roots protected by dark, moist soil wrapped in burlap. The leaves shivered as he lifted it with both hands, cradling it like a newborn child. There was no ceremony, no speech, no one there to applaud. Just him and the sapling and the quiet morning air. He lowered the roots into the hole and began to fill the earth back in, one handful at a time. His palms pressed the soil tight around the stem. His fingers lingered on the tender green leaves, and for a long moment he simply knelt there, breathing slow, as if anchoring something deeper than wood into the ground. A breeze moved through the park, carrying the faint scent of wet earth. A single crow perched on a lamppost nearby, head cocked, watching as if it too understood the gravity of what was happening. The man smiled faintly to himself. No one would know. That was the point. Plant a tree, walk away. Let the world find it years later and never know who to thank. He wiped his hands on his jeans, leaving dark streaks, and reached back into the bag for a small metal stake and a strip of cloth. He pressed the stake into the soil beside the sapling, tying the trunk gently so it would grow straight and strong. The cloth was frayed, perhaps from something personal, an old scarf maybe, or a sleeve. He tied it carefully, almost reverently, and sat back again. The park around him slowly stirred awake. A jogger passed on the far path, earbuds in, glancing briefly before continuing on. A dog trotted after a pigeon, but no one came close enough to see the details. He was content with that. He had not come here for an audience. His thoughts wandered as he watched the tiny tree stand bravely in its new home. He remembered sitting under a tree like this as a child, tracing the lines on his palm while the wind whispered through the leaves. He remembered a time in his life when shadows were the only shelter he had, and someone long before him had given him a place to rest. He reached out and touched the leaves again. They trembled under his fingertips. "Grow strong," he murmured under his breath, a private blessing carried away by the wind. For a moment, the weight he carried, the years of loss, of goodbyes, of the quiet sadness he hid from the world, seemed to lift. He was just a man in a tree and a new beginning. He leaned back on his heels, wiped the sweat from his brow, and let his gaze drift up to the sky, painted now with soft gold and pale blue. A deep breath filled his chest. He felt something settle inside him, like a knot finally untied. Then, as he brushed the dirt from his hands, the sound of squeaking wheels broke the silence. A child's bicycle rattled down the nearby path. The boy rode slowly, one hand on the handlebar, the other clutching a strap of his backpack. The man noticed him but said nothing, returning his focus to the small tree as if the work itself were enough to explain everything. The boy slowed, curiosity bright in his eyes. He had never seen anyone do something like this, not here. He stopped completely, resting one foot on the ground, staring at the hooded man who planted trees where no one would see. The man glanced up, their eyes met, and in that shared silence a story began to form, one that neither of them would ever forget. The boy stayed still for a long moment. His bike tilted slightly as the front wheel nudged against the edge of the worn stone path, and his eyes kept darting between the man's hands and the sapling that now stood upright in soft earth. He had come through this park every weekday morning for as long as he could remember, weaving through puddles after the rain, dodging flocks of pigeons, counting cracks in the pavement to pass the time before school. But he had never seen anyone like this, never seen someone kneel in silence and treat a simple tree as though it was something holy. He glanced over his shoulder to see if any other grown UPS were watching, perhaps a city worker supervising or a neighbor checking on the old benches, but there was no one else close enough to care. The man, still crouched, took a small bottle of water from his bag and poured it slowly over the base of the tree. His movements deliberate, his face calm but marked by something deep in his eyes, something that looked like memory. The boy stepped off his bike, feeling the crunch of gravel under his sneakers, and walked closer, drawn by a pull he could not name. He was shy by nature, always the quiet one in class, but the sight of this stranger and his secret act stirred a strange courage in him. He stopped a few feet away and cleared his throat, almost hoping the man would not hear. But the man looked up instantly, a faint smile touching his lips as if he had been expecting company all along. The boy hesitated, words sticking in his throat, then finally managed, in a voice barely above a whisper, "Mister, why are you planting a tree here? Nobody will even notice it." His own question surprised him because he had never cared about trees or parks before, but something about this moment felt important, like asking would make him part of whatever this man was doing. The man sat back on his heels, brushing dirt from his fingers, and studied the boy with a softness that made him feel safe. The boy noticed the details now. The man's jeans streaked with soil, the calluses on his knuckles, the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and long roads. The boy wondered if he was poor or lost, or simply strange, but there was something steady in the way he moved, something that told him this man was not lost at all. The man looked at the sapling for a long moment, then back at the boy, and his voice, when it came, was low and thoughtful, like someone speaking a truth they had carried for years. "When I was your age," he said slowly, "I used to sit under a tree just like this one back in my hometown. I would sit there on the hottest days and read or dream or just listen to the wind in the leaves. Someone planted that tree long before I was born. I never knew who, but it gave me shade, gave me peace. It gave me a place when I had none." The boy blinked, caught off guard by the gentleness of the words, and found himself stepping closer, almost kneeling without realizing it. The man's eyes drifted to the distance as if he were watching some scene only he could see, and he added, "I owe them, whoever they were. I owe them this, so I plant. Maybe one day someone will sit here when they have nowhere else to go." The boy felt a lump in his throat, the kind that came when teachers spoke of heroes in books, or when his grandmother told him bedtime stories about good men who lived simply. He looked at the small tree, its thin leaves trembling in the morning breeze, and felt a strange warmth spread through his chest. For a moment he did not feel like a boy on his way to school. He felt like someone witnessing a secret, something quiet and good in a world that often felt too loud. Around them, the park was slowly filling with life. An elderly woman feeding crumbs to birds near the fountain, a man in a suit hurrying by with coffee in hand, a mother pushing a stroller while humming softly to her baby. But here in this corner, the world had narrowed to just two people and a young tree. The boy crouched beside the man, not caring if dirt stained his knees, and whispered, But people won't remember you for this. The man smiled, a small, almost sad smile, and replied, "They don't have to. That's the point." He took the boy's hand gently and guided it toward the loose soil. "Here, press it down firm like this. Help me." The boy obeyed, pushing the earth around the roots, feeling the cool dampness against his fingers, feeling for the first time what it meant to give life to something that would outlive him. In that moment he understood without words that there are acts that matter even when no one claps, even when no one knows your name. They finished pressing the soil in silence, and the boy noticed how careful the man was with every motion, how his rough hands moved with a tenderness that seemed to come from somewhere far away. He wanted to ask more. "Who are you? Why are you here?" But something in the man's eyes told him not to break the spell. A soft wind carried the scent of earth and the faint sound of distant traffic, and for a long while they simply knelt there, side by side, two strangers bound by a seedling and a shared understanding that the smallest acts can carry the deepest meaning. The boy looked up and thought he saw something like grief flicker across the man's face, as though planting this tree was not just a gift but also a way to heal something broken inside. Before he could speak again, the man patted the soil one last time and sat back, looking at the sapling with quiet pride. "One day," he said softly, almost to himself, "this will be taller than you, taller than me, and someone will sit here and think, 'Thank you, whoever you are.'" The boy nodded slowly, not trusting his voice, feeling tears prick at the corners of his eyes for reasons he did not fully understand. He thought about his father, who had left 2 years ago and never returned, and wondered if anyone would ever plant a tree for him. He thought about how lonely school felt sometimes, how small the world could seem when no one noticed you, and for the first time in a long time he felt like he belonged to something bigger than himself. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands, and the man stood too, towering but gentle, the kind of presence that made you believe in good things. The boy wanted to stay, to ask more, to learn everything he could from this stranger, but a distant bell from the nearby church reminded him that time was moving. He picked up his bike and looked back one last time. The man was still there, crouched beside the tree, his hand resting on the thin trunk, eyes closed as if in silent prayer. The boy pedaled away slowly, but the image burned in his mind. A man planting hope in silence, expecting nothing, giving everything. And though he would not know it for years, that morning would shape the way he saw the world forever. The boy's tires clicked softly as he rode away, but he did not go far. Curiosity tugged at him until he circled back, leaving his bike hidden behind a low hedge so he could return unnoticed. He crept closer, heart thudding, and found the man still kneeling, still adjusting the soil, still tending the young sapling as though every grain of dirt mattered. The sun was climbing higher now, melting away the morning mist, and shafts of light cut through the branches of older trees, striping the ground with gold. The boy crouched behind a bush, watching, and after a few minutes he could not hold back any longer. He stepped out, brushing leaves from his shirt, and asked again, louder this time, "Why are you doing this? You could be anywhere else." The man startled slightly, then laughed softly, not at the boy but at the timing of the question. He sat back on his heels and rested one hand on his knee, his eyes thoughtful, his expression suddenly distant. He was not the kind of man who answered questions quickly. His silence stretched out like a tide going out, long and calm, until the boy wondered if he had even heard. Then he spoke, slowly, every word weighed and chosen. "Because someone once planted something for me," he said, his voice roughened by emotion, "and they never got to see what it became." He reached out, touching the thin trunk, and the boy saw how careful his fingers were, how they trembled just slightly. "When I was a child," the man continued, "I used to sit under an old tree behind my school. It wasn't much, just a tree, but it was where I went when the world felt too heavy. My mother was sick, my father was gone, and that tree was the only place that felt safe. I'd sit there for hours, listening to the leaves, and one day I realized someone had to plant it, someone I would never meet, someone who probably never imagined a boy like me sitting there, but they gave me a gift, and I've been trying to give it back ever since." The boy stood frozen, his chest tightening as he absorbed the words. He had never heard a grown man speak so openly, so gently, as though the truth itself was fragile. Around them the park seemed to fade away. The distant sounds of traffic dulled, the chatter of birds softened, and even the sunlight seemed to settle more warmly on that patch of ground. The boy glanced at the man's face, at the lines carved by time and grief, and saw something like pain there, but also peace. "But," the boy started, struggling to find the words, "but people won't know you did this. They won't remember." The man smiled, a slow curve of his lips that did not quite reach his eyes but carried an undeniable kindness. "They don't have to remember me," he said. "The tree is enough. The tree will speak for itself long after I'm gone. One day, someone will sit under its branches. Maybe they'll feel safe, maybe they'll dream, maybe they'll just rest their tired feet. They won't know me, but they'll feel what I felt. That's all that matters." The boy blinked back sudden tears, confused by the surge of emotion in his chest, and asked softly, Do you plant a lot of trees?" The man chuckled quietly, shaking his head. "Not enough. I should have started sooner, but I plant whenever I can, every chance I get, because this world, it needs more shade than we think." He looked at the boy then, truly looked at him, and in that gaze the boy felt seen in a way he never had before. "And you," the man said gently, "you could plant something too, not just trees. Words, kindness, anything that grows." The boy felt his throat tighten, the way it did when his teacher read sad stories aloud, and he crouched down beside the man without asking, pressing his own small hands into the soil, feeling the damp coolness, the rough texture of roots, the promise of growth. They worked in silence for a while, side by side, their shadows stretching long across the grass. The boy thought of his father, who had left without saying goodbye, and wondered if somewhere, somehow, a tree grew in his memory too. The man glanced at him, perhaps sensing the thought, and said softly, "You know, every tree is a message to the future. Even if no one hears your name, they'll feel what you did." The boy nodded, swallowing hard, and tried to memorize every detail. The smell of the earth, the feel of the soil, the calm in the man's voice, so he could carry it with him forever. He looked up and saw the man's eyes glisten, as though memories were rising too quickly to hold back. "Who planted yours?" the boy asked suddenly. The man took a long breath, gaze lifting to the sky where a single bird wheeled above. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "Maybe someone who needed hope. Maybe someone who believed in giving. I just know. They saved me without ever knowing my name." The boy lowered his head, touched by the weight of those words, and the silence between them became something sacred. Like the hush inside a chapel, a breeze moved through, rustling the sapling's leaves, and for a fleeting moment it felt as though the tree itself were listening. The man placed his hand over the boy's smaller one, pressing gently into the earth. "Remember this," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion that trembled within it. "We do not plant for ourselves. We plant for those we'll never meet. That's how the world keeps going." The boy felt his heart ache and swell at once, a rush of feeling he could not explain, and nodded without speaking. His eyes fixed on the tiny tree that now stood a little straighter in the soil. In that moment he knew without doubt that he would never see a tree the same way again, because each one would whisper of someone unseen, someone who gave quietly and walked away, someone like the man kneeling beside him now. The boy wanted to ask more, wanted to stay there all day. But the school bell rang faintly in the distance, carried on the wind, and reality crept back in. He rose reluctantly, brushing his dirt-streaked hands on his shorts, and the man stood too, towering yet humble, his hoodie stained with soil and morning light. The boy looked up at him, memorizing the curve of his gentle smile, the calm in his eyes, the weight of his words, and felt something shift inside him, like a seed being planted in his own heart, one that would grow for years to come. The boy lingered at the edge of the path, his bike resting against his side as he hesitated, torn between the pull of school bells in the distance and the strange gravity of what he had just witnessed. The man, still crouched near the sapling, remained motionless, his palm gently cupping one of the tender leaves as though listening to its heartbeat. The boy took a few steps backward, then stopped again, glancing around as a breeze carried the scent of freshly turned soil. A passing jogger slowed his pace, frowning at the sight of the man kneeling in the dirt. He removed an earbud and called out, "Hey, you okay over there?" His tone was cautious, suspicious even, as if trying to determine whether this lone gardener was meant to be here. The man simply nodded, his hand still resting on the tree, and replied softly, "I'm okay, just planting something." The jogger tilted his head, confusion knitting his brow, and for reasons he could not explain. He stepped off the path and approached. The boy watched silently as the jogger stopped a few feet away. Hands on his hips, breathing heavily, staring down at the sapling. "That's not city work," the jogger muttered. You're just doing this." The man nodded again, the faintest smile brushing across his lips, and said nothing more. The jogger crouched beside him, curiosity now stronger than caution, and brushed his fingertips across the soil as if trying to understand. A moment later, a woman walking her dog paused nearby, tugged by the sight of two grown men crouched over a tiny tree. She pulled out one earbud and asked, "What's going on?" Her tone was sharp at first, protective, but softened as she saw the look in the man's eyes when he glanced up. "Just planting," he said simply. The woman blinked, stepping closer despite herself, and soon she too was leaning in to look at the sapling, her dog sniffing curiously at the edges of the disturbed earth. "Is this for something? A memorial?" she asked quietly, almost reverently. The man looked at her for a long moment, then shook his head. "No," he replied. "It's for anyone who needs it. Someday." The woman's hand went to her mouth, her eyes glistening unexpectedly, and she knelt beside him without thinking, her knees pressing into the damp grass. "That's—" she began, but words failed her, so she just shook her head and smiled. The boy, still watching from a distance, felt his chest tighten with something new, something warm. More footsteps crunched on the path. An older couple with matching scarves, a teenage girl carrying a sketchbook, a young father pushing a stroller who stopped when his toddler pointed at the scene with a chubby finger and exclaimed, "Tree!" One by one they slowed, curiosity drawing them nearer, until a small ring of people formed around the man and his sapling. No one spoke for a moment. The only sounds were the distant hum of traffic and the gentle rustle of leaves overhead. Then the teenage girl asked softly, "Why?" And the man, still crouched, still gentle, looked up and repeated the words he had given the boy earlier. "Someone once planted a tree for me," he said, his voice carrying through the quiet morning air, "and they never knew what it would mean. I can't thank them, but I can do the same for someone else." A silence rippled through the gathered crowd. The young father knelt, placing his free hand on the ground beside the man's, and his toddler giggled, poking at the soil. The older woman in the couple sniffled softly, her husband's hand tightening on hers as if to steady her heart. The sketchbook girl flipped to a blank page and began to draw, her pencil scratching softly as she tried to capture the image. The hooded man, the sapling, the ring of strangers drawn by something unspoken. More people began to slow as they passed. A cyclist pulling over, a man in a suit late for work who found himself rooted to the spot, a bus driver who parked his empty vehicle at the curb and stepped out to see what was happening. The crowd thickened, but it did not feel like a crowd. It felt like a hush, a sacred bubble in the middle of the city, as if the earth itself had paused to witness an act too rare to ignore. Someone pulled out a phone, hesitated, then lowered it again, sensing that this moment was not meant for viral headlines but for memory. A little girl with pigtails whispered to her mother, "He's a good man, isn't he?" And her mother, eyes shining, nodded without taking her gaze from the man in the hoodie. The boy who had first spoken stepped forward now, emboldened by the circle of grown-ups who had all come to the same silent realization he had felt earlier, that there was something extraordinary in this simple act. He crouched beside the man again, their shoulders brushing, and whispered, "See? Now everyone knows." The man looked at him, eyes soft but serious, and shook his head gently. "It's not about them knowing," he said. "It's about the tree growing." The boy felt the weight of those words settle over him like a warm blanket, and he smiled through the sudden sting in his eyes. Around them, people began to murmur, memories of their own childhood trees, their own hidden acts of kindness, their own regrets about things left undone. A young woman spoke up, her voice trembling. "I used to sit under a tree with my brother. He's gone now. But thank you." The man nodded quietly, his gaze dropping back to the sapling, and the crowd fell silent again, each person wrapped in private thoughts, private emotions, private echoes of something they had almost forgotten, that the world is held together not by grand speeches or monuments but by small, quiet acts like this. A breeze swept through the park, carrying with it the mingled scents of earth and grass and far-off blossoms, and the sapling's leaves trembled as if acknowledging the gathering. The man rose slowly, brushing dirt from his knees, and looked around at the faces before him. He did not seem surprised by them, only grateful. "Take care of it," he said softly. "It's yours now." Then he slung his bag over his shoulder, gave the boy one last nod, and turned to leave. His steps slow but steady. The crowd parted instinctively, watching him go in silence, their eyes following until he disappeared beyond the curve of the path, and when he was gone, they remained there, still gathered around the small tree, feeling as though they had just witnessed something sacred, something that would live far longer than any of them. The boy stayed the longest, kneeling by the sapling, pressing his hand gently to the soil where roots had begun their journey, feeling in his heart that this moment, this man, this tree, would never fade from his memory. Long after the man's figure faded into the morning light and the crowd had dispersed, the boy stayed kneeling by the sapling, fingertips brushing the soil as though trying to memorize its texture, the faint dampness clinging to his skin. The park had begun to awaken fully now. Children laughed in the distance on their way to school. A street vendor began setting up a cart that smelled of roasted peanuts, and the cries of gulls floated over from the nearby river. But here by the tree, time felt different, slower, as though some invisible thread connected this moment to something much larger than the boy could see. He watched a single droplet of water slide from a leaf and fall into the earth, and it struck him that maybe people were like trees, rooted in places, giving shade without ever knowing who might rest beneath it. He rose at last, brushing his palms on his shorts, and pedaled away with a strange energy burning in his chest, a sense that he had seen something that would shape him forever. At school that day he barely heard the lessons, his mind replaying the words, the gestures, the quiet conviction of the man who had planted something without expecting anything back. At lunch he told his friends in a rush of excitement, but they laughed in the careless way children sometimes do, more interested in video games and gossip than a stranger in a park. Still, the boy's voice held a new edge of certainty as he said, "You'll see, that tree's going to mean something someday." He did not argue further. He just tucked the memory close to his heart and carried it with him. Meanwhile, across the city, the woman with the dog found herself unable to stop thinking about what she had witnessed. She walked her usual route, the leash wrapped loosely around her hand, but every corner seemed to remind her of the man kneeling in the dirt, of his words about planting for someone you may never meet. That evening, instead of scrolling through endless feeds before bed, she found herself outside in her backyard, staring at a small patch of empty soil. She thought of her late father, who used to plant roses every spring, and she made a decision. The next day she went to a nursery and brought home a sapling of her own. She planted it with her hands in the cool earth, feeling as though she was joining a quiet movement she could not name, a movement that had begun in a city park with a man who expected no thanks. The jogger, too, carried the image with him into his day. He was not usually a man to dwell on strangers. His mornings were for training, his afternoons for meetings, his evenings for collapsing in front of a television. But that night, as he sat alone in his apartment eating dinner from a plastic container, he glanced at the single potted plant on his windowsill, half dead, forgotten, and felt a pang of shame. He thought of how the man had smiled when he said, "The tree will speak for itself." He got up from the table, found his shoes, and walked to the nearest store to buy soil and seeds. He stayed up late repotting that dying plant, whispering to it as though apologizing for his neglect, and when he was finished, he felt lighter somehow, as if part of the dirt from the park still clung to his own hands. Across town, the sketchbook girl sat in a cafe, her pencil moving furiously as she tried to capture the scene before the memory faded. The man crouched low, the boy beside him, the small sapling that seemed to glow in the morning sun, the circle of strangers drawn together by a single quiet act. She added details, the tilt of the man's head, the way his fingers curved protectively around the stem, the expressions on the faces of those who watched. And when she was done, she tore the page from her book and pinned it to a community board near the counter. The next day, someone took a picture of her drawing and shared it online with a caption. "I saw something beautiful today. A man planted a tree in our park and reminded us what kindness looks like." The image spread quietly but steadily, shared from phone to phone, whispered from one comment thread to another. No one knew the man's name, and that seemed to make the story even more powerful. It was not about celebrity or headlines. It was about a seed planted in more ways than one. Within days, others began to post their own photos and stories. A woman in another city planting flowers outside a bus stop. A man teaching neighborhood kids how to care for a garden in a forgotten lot. A grandfather showing his granddaughter how to tend a bonsai tree. They did not know about each other, but each act was connected by that invisible thread, a ripple spreading from one quiet moment in a park. Even those who never touched soil found themselves changed. A teacher read the online story aloud to her class, and one student went home and asked his mother if they could plant something together. A shopkeeper printed the drawing and taped it to his window, adding a small handwritten note beneath it. "Be kind. Plant something." Back in the park, days turned into weeks, and the sapling stood a little taller each morning, its leaves a little broader, its roots reaching deeper into the earth. The boy visited whenever he could, sometimes before school, sometimes after, bringing a small bottle of water from home to pour carefully around the base. Each time he knelt in the grass, he remembered the man's words and felt them growing inside him like roots of his own. Strangers continued to pause by the tree, drawn by the small handmade sign someone had placed nearby. "Planted with love. Please care for me." Some left notes tucked into the soil, some left flowers or tiny stones, and some simply stood in silence, their faces softening as they gazed down at the sapling. None of them knew the man's name, but they all felt as if they had met him, and far away, wherever the man had gone after leaving the park. He carried no phone alerts, no headlines, no praise. He did not know that his act had been seen, or that it had begun to spread like sunlight through dark places. He simply kept walking, perhaps to another park, perhaps to another patch of earth waiting for something to take root. His hands were still streaked with dirt, his jeans still worn, his hoodie still pulled low against the wind, but there was a lightness in his step now, a sense that he had done something right, something lasting, even if no one ever told him so. That night, as the boy lay in bed replaying the morning over and over, he stared at the ceiling and whispered to himself, "One day, I'll plant 100 trees." He did not know if anyone heard him, but deep in the park, under the silver glow of the moon, the young sapling seemed to shiver as if in answer, its leaves stirring softly in the night air, already carrying the promise of everything it would one day become. Months passed, and the seasons turned with quiet persistence, painting the park in layers of color and shadow. Spring gave way to the long bright days of summer, and the sapling, once fragile and trembling, stood taller now, its thin trunk wrapped in the gentle support of the stake, its leaves a fuller green that caught the morning light like shards of glass. The boy, now taller himself and with a scattering of freckles from the sun, visited whenever he could, sometimes with a bottle of water, sometimes with nothing but his presence, sitting cross-legged in the grass, talking to the tree as though it could answer. On weekends he would bring friends, not to boast but to show them quietly. "Look, this is ours now." They would stand awkwardly at first, unsure why such a small thing mattered, but then they would feel the cool breeze through the leaves and hear the soft rustle overhead and fall silent, struck by the unspoken weight of the story the boy told. He would recount the morning he met the man, every detail etched into his memory. The soil on his hands, the calm in his voice, the simple words about planting for those you may never meet. Some of the children laughed nervously, uncomfortable with the seriousness in his tone, but others nodded, their eyes wide, as though sensing that they were standing in a place touched by something rare. By autumn the park had changed. What was once overlooked began to draw people in. The woman with the dog returned often, her own backyard sapling now thriving, and she would bring extra water or compost to leave at the base. The jogger became a familiar face, slowing his pace whenever he passed, always touching the leaves in greeting. The sketchbook girl pinned a copy of her finished painting to the community board in the park itself, protected by a sheet of glass, so that anyone passing could see the moment that started it all. Beneath it, someone taped a handwritten note that simply read, "Whoever you are, thank you." No one ever replaced it. The paper curled with rain and time, but it remained, a quiet testament that words could last as long as roots. Winter came, and the sapling's leaves fell, leaving only a slender trunk and bare branches reaching skyward. The boy stood before it in the snow, bundled in his thick coat, worried that perhaps it would not survive. But the woman with the dog smiled and told him gently, "It's resting, that's all. Things that matter take their time." And so he waited through storms and cold mornings until spring returned and the first buds appeared like small green lanterns, proof that life had continued unseen. By then, the park had developed a reputation. People spoke of it in quiet conversations, about the little tree that had no plaque, no donor name, no official sign. Teachers began bringing students on walks to show them how something so small could change the way a place felt. Gardeners began tending other neglected corners of the park, inspired by the mystery of that first sapling. Where weeds once grew, flowers began to bloom. Where trash once gathered, benches were cleaned and painted. Where loneliness had lingered, laughter began to echo. The boy grew older, his visits fewer as schoolwork and family responsibilities demanded more of his time, but he never forgot. On his hardest days, he would stop by in the evening, leaning against the trunk that was now strong enough to hold his weight, and close his eyes, remembering the man's words, "We do not plant for ourselves." Sometimes he would bring a book, sitting in the shade just as the man once had, reading by the soft golden light filtering through the branches. Strangers still passed, still paused, still asked questions, and he would tell the story as best as he could. Some left with tears in their eyes, others left with a quiet determination to plant something of their own. The tree became a kind of shrine, though no one called it that. It was simply a place where people felt safe, where they felt reminded that goodness could be simple and anonymous and lasting. Years later, the boy, now a young man, returned with a camera. The tree had grown broad and full, its roots thick and sure, and the light through its canopy dappled the ground in shifting patterns. He took photographs from every angle, capturing the way the branches reached out as if embracing the world, the way people still gathered beneath it without quite knowing why. He pinned one of those photographs beside the old sketch, and beneath it he wrote, "Planted by someone who believed in the future." He never signed his name. It felt truer that way, truer to the spirit of the man who had begun it all. And though he did not know it, elsewhere in the city, the jogger had planted an entire row of saplings along his apartment building. The woman with the dog had started a neighborhood garden. The sketchbook girl had sold her painting to raise funds for more trees in other parks. And the story, once a small secret, had traveled far beyond them all. One evening, many years after that morning, a group of children played tag around the tree, their laughter bright in the warm air. One little girl stopped to catch her breath and leaned against the trunk, staring up at the branches swaying gently above her. She asked her grandfather, who sat on a nearby bench, "Who planted this tree?" The old man, none other than the boy who had once asked the same question, smiled softly, eyes misting as he replied, "Someone who wanted you to have shade." The little girl tilted her head, thinking about that, then wrapped her arms around the trunk in a clumsy hug before running off again, her laughter joining the rustle of the leaves. And somewhere far away, perhaps walking another quiet park, perhaps tending another hidden corner of the world, the man in the gray hoodie might have felt something deep in his chest, a warmth and knowing that the seed he had planted that morning had grown into more than a tree. It had grown into a legacy, years folded into decades, and the park itself became almost unrecognizable compared to the neglected patch of grass it once was. New paths curved gently around old oaks and young maples. Benches lined with fresh coats of paint welcomed weary travelers, and the air always seemed to carry a mix of earth and blossoms. But at the heart of it all, the The very first tree planted by a man whose name most would never know, stood tall and wide, its canopy stretching like a cathedral ceiling of green and gold. People no longer asked why it was there. It felt as though it had always been part of the park, but those who knew the story still whispered it to newcomers, as though sharing a sacred secret. One late afternoon, when the sun dipped low and cast a honeyed glow across the leaves, the boy who had once asked that life-changing question returned. No longer a boy, but a man with silver in his hair and lines of time etched around his eyes. He carried no tools, no cameras, no offerings. Only his presence and the weight of years lived beneath countless skies. He walked slowly, every step a memory, until he reached the tree and laid a weathered hand against its trunk, feeling the steady thrum of life within. Around him, children played tag, their laughter rising like birdsong. A mother rocked a baby to sleep on a nearby bench. A young couple posed for engagement photos beneath the sweeping branches. None of them knew him, and he felt no need to tell them who he was, or how he had once pressed his own small hands into the soil here. He simply watched, a quiet witness to a living legacy. He closed his eyes and remembered that morning years ago. The mist, the soft voice, the words that had planted more than roots. He thought of the strangers who had gathered, the way a single act had rippled outward to gardens, to drawings, to other parks, to countless hearts touched by something they could not fully explain. He wondered where the man in the gray hoodie might be now, perhaps gone, perhaps planting still, perhaps watching another boy ask a question that would change him forever. The thought brought a sting to his eyes, and he let the tears come, not in grief but in gratitude. When he opened his eyes, the sun was sinking lower, and golden light poured through the branches, illuminating specks of dust and pollen that danced in the warm breeze. A young girl skipped up to him, holding a notebook and pencil. "Mister," she said shyly, "I'm supposed to write about something beautiful for school. Do you know any stories?" He looked down at her bright eyes and felt his heart swell. He crouched to her level, resting one hand on the rough bark. "Yes," he said softly, "I know one." And there, beneath the sheltering arms of a tree planted by hands long gone, he told her. He told her about a man who came alone one morning and gave something to the future. He told her about how it changed a park, a city, and lives far beyond what anyone could see. As he spoke, more children gathered, and parents paused to listen, and even those hurrying by slowed their steps. The air grew still, as though the park itself held its breath. When he finished, the little girl hugged her notebook to her chest and whispered, "I want to plant something too." He smiled through his tears and replied, "Then you already understand." The children ran off, chattering excitedly about what they would plant, and the man remained, standing beneath the tree as the shadows lengthened and evening fell. Lanterns flickered on along the paths, and the sky deepened to indigo. He stood there until the first stars appeared, until the laughter faded and the park grew quiet. Then he stepped back, giving the tree one last look, a silent thank you, and walked away into the night. No one marked his passing, no one called out his name, but the tree remained strong and steady, whispering its story to the wind, sheltering strangers who might never know why it felt so safe, so good, so full of life. And somewhere, perhaps in another forgotten corner of another park, another pair of hands pressed soil around another sapling, and another boy watched, and another question was asked, and the legacy continued, quiet and unstoppable, like roots growing deeper with every passing year.